Twenties and a New Society. Lecture terms. The Business of America. Focus question. Who benefited and who suffered in the new consumer society of the 1920s? A decade of prosperity. The chief business of the American people, said Calvin Coolidge, president after Warren G. Harding's death in 1923, is business. Economic expansion, partnership between business and government, and business values seemed greater in the 1920s than at any previous point in American history. After the post-war recession receded in 1920, the decade was one of extraordinary prosperity. Productivity and output will skyrocket as new industries such as chemicals and electronics grow, and older industries adopted Ford's moving assembly line. Automobiles so stimulated economic growth that auto factories, not iron and steel mills, came to embody American industrial power. Because of this, car production tripled in this decade. General Motors surpassed Ford, and by 1929, half of American families owned a car. The auto industry sparked the growth of steel, rubber, oil production, road construction, and other economic sectors. It also promoted tourism and the expansion of the suburbs. In this decade, America's multinational corporations also extended their penetration of international markets. The dollar, as a result, became the most important currency in world trade, and American industry still led other nations in output. In the 1920s, consumer goods for the first time became attainable by most Americans. Goods made available by credit and installment buying plans, like vacuum cleaners, telephones, washing machines, and refrigerators, all will transform daily life for everyone. Advertising and marketing professionals found new ways to compel Americans to purchase these kinds of items. From the new industrial plenty, Americans spent more time on leisure activities as well. This would range anywhere from vacations to sports and movies. Radios and phonographs brought mass entertainment into private homes and gave birth to a new celebrity culture. Andre Siegfried, who visited the United States, wrote in 1928 that, quote, a new society had emerged in America, and Americans valued their, quote, standard of living above anything else. Americans' willingness to amass enormous amounts of debt in order to purchase consumer goods seemed to replace the 19th century values that the United States had of thrift and self-denial. Work, once seen as a point of pride in skill or of empowerment in trade unions, now seemed only a means to pursue individual fulfillment through consumption and entertainment. Despite the abundance of mass consumer society, there were limits of prosperity. The fruits of economic expansion were very unequally distributed. Real wages rose by 1/4 between 1922 and 1929, but corporate profits rose at more than twice this rate. Economic concentration continued in the upper levels, with a smaller number of firms and banks controlling more of industry and finance than ever before. In early 1929, the share of national income of the wealthiest 5% of American families exceeded that of the bottom 60%. The majority of families had absolutely no savings. 40% of Americans still lived in poverty, unable to enjoy the new consumer economy. Improved productivity allowed goods to be made with fewer workers. And while employment grew in some sectors, like retail and education, manufacturing employment dropped significantly for the first time in American history. A process known as deindustrialization began in the old industrial Northeast as businesses moved south to take advantage of cheaper and non-union labor. The farmer's plight is also something that needs to be determined. Farmers were also excluded from this prosperity. American agriculture had reached its zenith in World War I, when Europe's needs for food and government policies had kept farm prices artificially high. But increasing mechanization and the use of fertilizer and pesticides ultimately elevated the output, even as the world demand started to stagnate steadily. This caused a reducing of farm incomes and a forcing of tens of thousands of farm foreclosures. In the 1920s, for the first time in U.S. history, the number of farms and farmers declined. Extractive industries like mining and lumber also suffered from overproduction in the world market. Even before the 1930s, rural America was suffering from economic depression. The image of business. Although high unemployment crippled much of Europe in the 1920s due to the costs of World War I, America's high wages, America's efficient industry, and America's mass consumption projected a magical image of American wealth and permanent prosperity across the world. The Committee on Public Information's propaganda campaigns during World War I persuaded many advertisers that it was possible to, quote, sway the minds of entire populations. And many businesses established public relations departments, or PR departments, to defend corporate practices and win over a distrusting public. They successfully changed public attitudes towards Wall Street. Congressional hearings from 1912 to 1914, held by Representative Arsène Pujol of Louisiana, had exposed the big Wall Street banks' manipulation of stock prices. This strengthened popular views that investors were fleeced in the stock market. But by the 1920s, with stock prices rising, the market gained more investors, and by 1928, 1.5 million Americans owned stock, more than at any other previous time in U.S. history. With the defeat of the 1919 labor revolt and the dissolution of wartime regulations, business used the language of, quote, Americanism and, quote, industrial freedom against the unions. Some corporations in the 1920s adopted new styles of management called, quote, welfare capitalism, in which they offered employees private pensions, medical insurance plans, job security, as well as leisure programs. These businesses celebrated their attention to the, quote, human factor in industry. But more employers adopted what was known as the American Plan, whose basis was the, quote, open shop, a workplace free of government regulation and unions, except in some cases of company unions that were created and controlled by the management itself. These businesses believed that collective bargaining infringed on the liberties of management, and they argued that prosperity for all depended on complete freedom for business. Public relations campaigns linked unionism with socialism and sinister foreigners, and even the most forward-looking companies hired strikebreakers and detectives and blacklisted union members to prevent or defeat unions and strikes. In this hostile environment, unions lost more than 2 million members, and unions capitulated to employer demands in order to prevent their complete annihilation. Feminism makes a comeback. Like the unions, feminists tried to adapt to the new conservative atmosphere of the 1920s. Suffrage in 1920, given to women, ended the ties of solidarity that had united various groups of women reformers in the past. Black feminists now insisted that the movement demand the enforcement of the 15th Amendment in the South. But white activists offered little support to them. Long-standing divisions between two competing conceptions of woman's freedom, one that was based on motherhood, the other based on individual autonomy and the right to work. These now took shape in a debate over an Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. This was an amendment that was advocated by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. The proposed amendment would eliminate all legal distinctions, quote, on account of sex. Paul argued that now that women had the vote, they no longer needed special legal protections and needed equal access to employment, education, and other opportunities. But many women reformers who supported mothers' pensions and laws limiting women's work hours, which the ERA threatened to dismantle, vehemently opposed this Equal Rights Amendment. Every major women's organization, other than the National Women's Party, ended up opposing the ERA. The ERA campaign failed, and in 1929, Congress repealed the Shepard-Towner Act of 1921, which had offered federal assistance programs for infant and child health. Pre-war feminism's emphasis on personal freedom blossomed in a growing consumer society, and women's liberation became a lifestyle promoted by advertisers and mass entertainment. This was detached from political or social radicalism altogether. Sexual freedom now meant individual autonomy or personal rebellion. The young, single, quote, flapper who smoked and danced, sported short hair and skirts, and used new birth control devices for having sex out of wedlock, came to symbolize the, quote, new woman. Business and government. Focus question. In what ways did the government promote business interests in the 1920s? The Republican era is where we begin talking about business and government. Government policy reflected the pro-business climate of the decade. Business lobbyists dominated national Republican Party conventions, calling on the federal government to lower taxes on both personal and corporate incomes. They also called for a maintaining of high tariffs and to reinforce employers' anti-union campaigns. To some, Presidents Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge had appointed so many pro-business members to both the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Trade Commission, as well as other progressive-era agencies, that they seemed to repeal the regulatory state altogether. The government resumed issuing court injunctions to halt strikes, as it did with the walkout of 250,000 railroad workers in 1922. Under William H. Taft, who was now appointed Chief Justice in 1921, the Supreme Court stayed extremely conservative, and a return to laissez-faire diminished progressive policies that had enhanced federal power. Laissez-faire meaning government keeping its hands off of the economy, less regulation of business practices. In 1923, the Supreme Court struck down Muller versus Oregon in a decision that overturned a minimum wage law for women in the nation's capital. The administration of the lackluster President Warren G. Harding became one of the most corrupt administrations in the United States history. Although his cabinet had a few men of talent and integrity, such as Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes and Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, Harding mostly appointed cronies who used their office for private gain. The most famous of several corruption scandals involved the leasing of government oil reserves to businessmen at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, by the Secretary of Interior Albert Fall. Fall was paid $500,000 for his services in guaranteeing that lease. As a result, Fall became the first cabinet member in history to receive a felony conviction. The 1924 election. Harding's successor was Calvin Coolidge. He had won fame as Massachusetts governor for using state troops to end a Boston policeman strike in 1919. But he was very uncharismatic. But compared to Harding, he seemed an honest Yankee. Coolidge continued Harding's policies without the corruption and scandal. In 1924, Coolidge was elected by a huge margin, defeating Democratic candidate John W. Davis, a Wall Street lawyer who had been nominated by a badly divided Democratic convention. 1/6 of the electorate in 1924 voted for Robert La Follette, a candidate of the new Progressive Party whose platform called for higher taxes on the wealthy, public ownership of railroads, farm relief, and a ban on child labor. Coolidge described the Progressive platform as a plan for, quote, a communistic and socialistic America. La Follette won the endorsements of progressives like the American Federation of Labor, but he raised very little money and carried only the state of Wisconsin. His candidacy, however, showed that discontent persisted under the surface of prosperity and conservatism. Foreign affairs also reflected the alliance between business and government. The decade of the 20s saw a retreat from Wilsonian internationalism toward a unilateral American action. Mostly, these actions were intended to boost exports and investment opportunities abroad. The so-called, quote, isolationism of the 1920s was a reaction against disappointments over Wilson's aggressive military and diplomatic stance on the world stage. The United States hosted the Washington Naval Arms Conference of 1922, which ultimately secured smaller navies for Britain, France, Japan, and Italy, but the United States would be able to maintain a larger navy. Even though they hosted that, the country, for the most part in the 20s, stayed outside of international struggles. The country would not become a member of the League of Nations because they never ratified the Versailles Treaty, and American tariffs were raised to their highest levels in history, repudiating Wilson's commitment to free trade. Foreign policy in the 20s was largely developed in private economic relationships rather than government activity. The United States emerged from World War I as the world's major manufacturing and financial power. In the 20s, New York bankers, sometimes acting alone and sometimes with the help from the Harding and Coolidge administrations, made huge loans to European and Latin American governments. European governments in particular needed this money to help them recoup after World War I. American industrial firms, especially in the automobile industry, as well as in agricultural machinery and electrical equipment manufacturing, established overseas plants to supply the world market and find cheaper labor. American investors gained control over raw materials such as copper in Chile and oil in Venezuela. When American economic interests seemed threatened, the government sent in the troops. Only when American economic interests seemed threatened, however. This caused the United States to invade once more in Nicaragua to suppress a nationalist revolt there. So much for national self-determination. The birth of civil liberties. Focus question. Why did the protection of civil liberties gain importance in the 1920s? Concern for civil liberties grew from the arrests of anti-war dissenters under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which inspired the formation of a group in 1917 that 3 years later became the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU. For the rest of the 20th century, the ACLU took on many of the important legal cases that established the, quote, rights revolution in America. The ACLU helped inject meaning into traditional liberties, such as freedom of speech, and invented new rights, such as the right to privacy. But the ACLU began as a coalition of pacifists, progressives, and lawyers outraged by the violation of Americans' rights by the government during World War I. Before the war, the Supreme Court had done very little to protect the rights of unpopular minorities. Initially, the Supreme Court itself restricted civil liberties. In 1919, the court upheld the constitutionality of the Espionage Act and the conviction of Charles T. Schneck, a socialist who sent anti-draft leaflets through the mail. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes spoke for the court when he declared that the First Amendment did not prevent Congress from prohibiting speech that presented, quote, a clear and present danger of inspiring illegal activity. Free speech, quote, would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic, he said. This became the basis of Supreme Court decisions in the future Supreme Court cases. But since it allowed public officials to determine what kind of speech was, quote, dangerous, it proved an arbitrary doctrine. In 1919, the court also upheld the conviction of Jacob Abrams and 5 other men for passing out pamphlets criticizing America's military intervention in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution during the Russian Civil War. But a minority dissented from the basis for future defenses of free speech as necessary for the, quote, great marketplace of ideas later on that decade. By the end of the 1920s, the court had invalidated state laws, making it illegal to advocate unlawful acts or changes in the political or economic system. The Sacco and Vanzetti case also helped to illustrate nativist prejudices. This is a case that is documented at the beginning of Chapter 20, showing you how freedom of speech was not guaranteed for all. The culture wars. Focus question. What were the major flashpoints between fundamentalism and pluralism in the 1920s? The fundamentalist revolt. Not all Americans embraced the modern urban culture and its religious and ethnic pluralism. Not all Americans embraced mass entertainment and sexual liberation. As a matter of fact, evangelical Protestants felt threatened by an apparent decline in traditional values. as well as felt threatened by the increased visibility of Catholicism and Judaism in the United States that was caused by immigration. They also opposed, quote, modernists within Protestant denominations who wanted to integrate science and religion and adapt Christianity to the new secular culture. Fundamentalists, convinced that the Bible's literal truth was the basis of Christian doctrine, started campaigns to divorce ideas of modernism from Christianity and to restrict individual freedoms. A good example is looking at the preachings of Billy Sunday. He was a professional baseball player who eventually became a revivalist preacher. He was perhaps the best known of the fundamentalists, and he may have preached to as many as 100 million people with messages damning Darwinism and drink. Fundamentalism flowered both in rural and urban areas, and it succeeded through prohibition in reducing alcohol consumption in many places. But many Americans saw prohibition as a violation of their personal freedoms. Prohibition also earned huge profits for those who trafficked in illegal alcohol and made pervasive government corruption. In 1925, a trial in Tennessee exposed the division between traditionalism and modern secular culture. John Scopes, a public school teacher, was arrested for violating the state law that prohibited the teaching of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. His trial attracted national attention and even was carried on live national radio. To fundamentalist Christians, the idea that humans had evolved over millions of years contradicted the Bible's account of creation. To Scopes' defenders, including the ACLU, freedom meant the right to independent thought and self-expression. They believed Tennessee's law showed the dangers of mixing church and state. The well-known labor lawyer, Clarence Darrow, defended Scopes and ultimately created a sensation when he called upon William Jennings Bryan to stand as a, quote, expert witness on the Bible. Bryan, however, showed a near-complete ignorance of modern science and an inability to deflect Darrow's sarcastic interrogation regarding the factual accuracy of biblical stories. Embarrassed, Bryan died shortly after the trial ended in a guilty verdict for Scopes, though the decision was later overturned and the movement for anti-evolution state laws expired. Ethnicity and the culture wars. Many rural and small-town native-born Protestants found immigrants and their cultures strange and threatening. Wartime demands for, quote, 100% Americanism persisted in the 1920s in public policy and behavior. The most militant expression of beliefs that American freedom's enjoyment should be limited according to religion and ethnicity was a rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s. By the mid-1920s, this group claimed more than 3 million members, almost all of them white and native-born Protestants, many of whom were not in the South but in the North and the West. Going beyond attacks on blacks, the new Klan targeted immigrants, especially Jews and Catholics, as well as other, quote, forces like feminism, unionism, and what they considered, quote, immorality. All these things seem to threaten American civilization and, quote, individual liberty. Although the Klan's influence waned by the end of the decade, its attacks on modern secularism and political, quote, radicalism, and its insistence that control of the nation be given back to, quote, citizens of the old stock, these represented popular sentiments throughout the United States. Many new laws transformed national identity and citizenship with newly exclusive definitions and restrictions. Immigration policy most represented this shift. Restrictions on immigration were nothing new, with the Naturalization Act of 1790 way back barring non-whites from migration, and the exclusion of various groups after 1875 that we've discussed in this class, including prostitutes and anarchists. But before World War I, the nation's doors were open to almost all white persons. In the 1920s, pressures for immigration restriction became overwhelming, and it signaled more than anything by the decline in the traditional opposition to restriction from employers who had welcomed a large labor supply as a check on higher wages. Ultimately, fears of immigrant-based political radicalism now outweighed the demands for cheap labor. Employers found cheap labor in African Americans who had left the South, and they had no need of this massive influx of immigrants from Europe. A 1921 law restricted immigration from Europe to 357,000 per year. In 1924, Congress imposed a permanent limitation on European immigration to 150,000 per year. This was distributed according to a series of national quotas that sharply restricted the numbers from Southern and Eastern Europe. This was intended to ensure that the descendants of the old immigrants would always outnumber those of the new immigrants. In 1924, a law barred entry of all those ineligible for naturalized citizenship, which included all Asians except for Filipinos. All of those who were designated, quote, American nationals. Congress in 1934 established a timetable for the Philippines' independence, largely as a way to end immigration. In 1924, the law for the first time effectively created the category of, quote, illegal alien. Race in law was also something that needed to be discussed about the 20s. The new immigration law demonstrated and intensified influence of, quote, race on public policy. By the early 1920s, both Northern and Southern political leaders agreed that blacks should be considered, quote, second-class citizens. But race policy did not just concern blacks, but involved the question of who would be, quote, American, particularly with regard to immigration. President Coolidge's Secretary of Labor, James J. Davis, argued that immigration policy, while once based on labor needs and the idea of America as an asylum of liberty, should now rest on a biological definition of the ideal population. The law also reflected progressive interests in improving the, quote, quality of democratic citizenship. This showed that progressive goals were infused with pseudo-scientific ideas about the superiority and inferiority of particular races. The Supreme Court admitted that the entire concept of race used to determine the immigration quotas lacked a scientific basis when it rejected the claims of an Indian-born World War I veteran who wanted to become naturalized, that he was a, quote, pure Aryan and therefore white. Aryan being the descendants of the northern Indian population from way back. The court argued that, quote, white was not a scientific concept, but rather part of a, quote, common speech to be interpreted with the understanding of the common man. Promoting tolerance. some Americans resisted the notion that Southern and Eastern Europeans could not become citizens or could only do so by adopting Anglo-Saxon culture. Horace Kallen, of Jewish German origins, coined the phrase, quote, cultural pluralism, to describe a society that celebrated ethnic diversity instead of suppressing it. Kallen argued that toleration of differences was uniquely American. Anthropologists such as Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict insisted that no basis existed in science for theories of racial superiority or a hierarchy of civilizations. But these had little effect on public policy. The new immigrants themselves were the best advocates for pluralist America, actually. Each ethnic group established its own ethnic enclaves with their own institutions, their own churches, their own theaters, and even their own newspapers. Nevertheless, they were integrated into American culture through mass consumption and mass culture. Immigrant groups facing prohibition, the Klan, and widespread anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism affirmed the validity of cultural diversity and defined the toleration of difference as an essential quality of American freedom. They reinvented themselves as, quote, ethnic Americans, claiming an equal right to participate in American life while remaining culturally distinct. Catholics and Jews celebrated their religious and ethnic culture without surrendering their belief that they should not experience discrimination or bigotry in public life because they were American. The Supreme Court helped secure the shift in law by striking down a Nebraska statute prohibiting instruction in languages other than English. This was a law that was intended to ban German from education in that state. The last thing in the culture wars we're going to discuss in this lecture is what happened in Harlem during the decade of the 20s. This decade saw a rising black self-consciousness, especially in the North's urban ghettos, like Harlem. Almost 1 million blacks had left the South in the Great Migration, many of them moving to New York and Chicago, as well as other countless smaller cities. Harlem in New York became a center of African American life, attracting those immigrants coming from the South, as well as blacks coming from the West Indies, among whom were many well-educated, professional, and white-collar workers who were shocked by the American racism that they saw. Whites, quote, slummed in Harlem, visiting its dance halls, jazz clubs, and speakeasies, contributing to depictions of Harlem as a place of primitive passions. But the real Harlem was a place of poverty and low-wage work created and reinforced by housing discrimination. Harlem contained, however, a dynamic black cultural community with connections to New York's artistic mainstream. This became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Poets and novelists such as Langston Hughes and Claude McKay were sponsored by white intellectuals and published by white presses. And Broadway, for the first time, presented black actors in serious roles, as well as shows that featured black singers. In art, the term, quote, new Negro meant rejecting established stereotypes and a search for black values to replace those stereotypes. This led the writers of what became called the, quote, Harlem Renaissance to the roots of the black experience in Africa, as well as the rural South's folk culture and life in the urban ghetto.